Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. So in the last couple of months I've done a couple of videos spotlighting Australian feminist and journalist Sherele Moody. And I use the term journalist very loosely, although that is her job that she's paid for. She hardly seems qualified to hold that title, as we will see. Now, you may remember her from a couple of recent videos. One was on the Australian femicide map. Femicide is the killing of women or females by males, and she included children who had been murdered by their mothers on this map to, increase the figures a little bit. And femicide is typically a hate crime, so it's a murder because the person is a female. And, she included things like people breaking into someone's home and murdering both the male and the female while robbing the place. Of course, the male isn't included on the map, but the female is for some reason. And I also did another video on the Red Heart campaign and a very interesting post left on the Red Heart campaign Facebook page. Now, it didn't have a name attached to that particular post. I speculated at the time that it might have been Sherele Moody who wrote it. I'm now convinced that it was, as we will see later in this video. But today I'm looking at an article that Sherele Moody wrote earlier this year. It's been on my to-do list for quite some time, and I've finally got around to it. And it's called "This Poll Question Shouldn't Have Been Asked." And it starts off with, if a woman hits you, would you hit her back? Now, I'll get back to that question later on, but there are some other things that I want to spend some time spotlighting first. But trust me, we will get back to that question by the end of this video. Now, I'm not going to go through every single word of this article. I just want to focus on some key points that Sherele Moody either gets completely wrong, and it's really baffling how she does, unless she's outright lying or is probably the worst journalist in Australia. I'll let you make up your own mind which one that is. And other things which are just downright dishonest. If you want to read the entire article from beginning to end, as always, there is a link below. Now, she starts out with, an online poll asking this question appeared on an Australian men's rights Facebook page about 2 weeks ago. Yeah, the thing is, it's not a men's rights Facebook page. As Sherele admits, kind of, in a little bit. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, she says, I've chosen not to name the organisation involved because the last thing it deserves is promotion. I'll refer to it as the MRA group. So, no citation. Now, surely this is a fail as a journalist, right? Surely, whenever you make a claim, you should have citations to back it up. But no, we're meant to take Sherele's word for it. We're meant to believe that not only is she honest and telling us the truth, but also that her claims are without fault, that at no point she's misinterpreted or misunderstood something or accidentally taken something out of context. We're just meant to take her word that she is 100% correct in all her assertions, with absolutely no way of checking to see if that's correct. Now, I shouldn't have to point out why this is a bad thing. If this was the normal standard, then anyone could just make any claim at any point. Like, for example, I could say that there is a feminist group which promotes the murder of newborn baby boys. And in fact, I do believe that Sherele Moody is one of the main members of this group. I think she might be the head member, in fact. Now, I'm not going to name the group because I don't want to promote them. You're just going to have to take my word for it that Sherele Moody is promoting the murder of baby boys without any evidence whatsoever. You're just going to have to take it on faith that I'm not saying this to besmirch her name or for political reasons or to make a point. Obviously, this is not good journalism, especially when Sherele Moody gets the key point that this is an MRA group wrong. Now, she does mention enough in this article that I know which group she's talking about. It's in fact an anti-feminist group which does not claim to be a men's rights group in any way. In fact, Sherele kind of admits this later on. She says, "Our society has major expectations for our blokes. We want them to be tough and manly, and if they show emotion, they are called derogatory feminine names like princess and pussy." Yet not to mention crying male tears, Sherele, a common thing said by feminists. But anyway, many people still expect men to fit certain stereotypes, including what it means to be a father. Even in 2018, blokes are encouraged to work hard and long hours to care for their families. And the cost to them is spending precious time with their children and partners. Yes, all things that actual MRA groups talk about, Sherele. You know, actual MRA groups bring this up, but you don't know that because you're talking at your ass, aren't you? Anyway, she goes on to say, "Yet the MRA group and others like it refuse to focus on the issues that need to change to improve the lives of the country's males." Now, I would argue, Sherele, that if these groups are not talking about men's issues and how to improve men's lives, then it's pretty fucking obvious that they're not MRA groups. They're anti-feminist groups. Now, this brings up the interesting question, why is it that feminists like Sherele and just about every feminist I come across, come to think of it, always insist that anti-feminist groups that do not talk about men's issues are men's rights activists? Now, I think in some cases it's just sheer fucking ignorance. It's just that they see anyone who disagrees with them as all part of the same group. But I think others know that there is a difference and are just basically lying to their viewers or their readers because it's easier to make a case against MRAs. Which brings up an interesting point. Why make the case against MRAs and not anti-feminists? Is it because they see MRAs as more of a threat? It's an interesting question. I might have to explore that in a later video. But yeah, basically she's admitted here that it is not an MRA group, even though she insists upon calling them MRAs throughout the article. But that's not the worst thing she does. There are much, much worse things coming up, trust me. That is one of her milder mistakes. So anyway, let's continue because there's some interesting stuff coming up. Instead, they use their power to cause division between the genders. Oh yeah, that's right. That's MRAs doing that, isn't it? Causing division between the genders. We're lucky that feminists aren't doing that. I'm sorry, I couldn't say that without laughing. Anyway, she continues. Almost always focusing on the one thing that is more likely to kill a woman than accidents or suicide, intimate partner violence. Now, in a previous video on the Red Heart campaign, there was a very, very similar comment, and I said at the time that I think the person who wrote the comment, which I think is pretty clearly Sherele Moody now, I said I thought that person worded that comment badly, that they were talking about women are more likely to be murdered by an intimate partner rather than be killed by any other means. There's a big difference between those two things. But here she is, coming right out and saying that intimate partner violence is more likely to kill a woman than accidents or suicide. And that's just an incredible claim. In that previous video, I stated that in 2016, something like 70 women had been murdered by their male partners, and I think it was over 700 women had committed suicide. So how a journalist can actually say that more women are killed by intimate partner violence than commit suicide is astounding, considering females commit suicide at 10 times the rate. And that's not including accidents either. She also says that intimate partner violence is more likely to kill women than accidents. It's just astounding stuff. And I can't figure out whether she is just lying, straight out fucking lying, and she knows that this is bullshit, or whether she is so deep in her ideology that she thinks this is actually the case. So it seems that Sherele Moody is incapable of doing even the most basic research, which once again is surprising that she works as a journalist, considering she can't do even the most basic of research. So let's do the research for her. So let's start with female suicides. So as I previously stated, I found an article stating that there were 70 women killed by male partners in 2016. And if we look at the causes of death in Australia in 2016, we find intentional self-harm is 713. Now it's interesting when we break this down, because the largest type of suicide that women commit is intentional self-harm by hanging, strangulation and suffocation. I'm a little bit surprised at that. I thought it would have been an overdose or something like that. But apparently in Australia, the way most women who commit suicide choose to do it is by hanging. Although I guess it could be argued that maybe more women attempt suicide with drug overdoses but survive. I guess that's possible. And I guess you're less likely to survive if you try hanging yourself or strangulation. But the number is 339, which is 4 to 5 times larger than the number of women who are killed by an intimate male partner. And once again, that's just one form of suicide, not the total number, which is 10 times larger. But let's have a look at some different types of accidents that might cause death. Accidental poisoning, 426 women. Last time I checked, that was larger than 70. Under other accidental threats to breathing, we have 87. So that's things like choking and suffocating in bed and things like that. So the total number is 87. And then if we look at falls, there was 1,380 women who died from accidental falls. In fact, falling on same level from slipping, tripping or stumbling is 176. So over 100 more women die from just falling than from domestic abuse. Yet Sherele Moody would have us believe that domestic abuse is the leading cause of female death. Complications of medical and surgical care, 95. So a woman is more likely to die from medical complications or surgical care than be murdered by a male partner. So, to put it very simply, the notion that a woman is more likely to be killed by a male partner than by accident or by suicide is laughable. Now, just why I'm looking at causes of death in Australia, whenever I do a hangout with people from outside of Australia, I constantly get shit about all the poisonous snakes and spiders in Australia. I'm constantly told that this is an extremely dangerous place to live because all the animals want to kill you. Apparently, there are hordes of snakes and spiders which we are constantly fending off with large machetes. So, just to put that to rest, let's have a look at the number of deaths by snakes and spiders in the year 2016. Now, remember, Australia has a population of 24 million people. So, contact with venomous animals and plants. 3 males, 1 female, 4 people in total. That is 4 people out of 24 million people. I think they're pretty good odds. So can we stop with the fucking, your country is so dangerous because of all the deadly snakes and spiders, etc., etc. It gets a little bit tiresome. So just to break that down, that is 1 male and 1 female who died because of contact with a venomous snake or lizard, and 0 people have died from contact with spiders. And 2 males have died from contact with hornets, wasps and bees, which I'm pretty sure they have in other countries as well. Probably an allergic reaction, if anything. So yeah, they're pretty good odds. They're pretty fucking good odds, I have to say. Now I'll probably get bitten by a fucking spider or snake and die because I've now cursed myself. But anyway, luckily I'm not superstitious. Let's go back to Sherele Moody's work of fiction because there's some very interesting bullshit we're just about to get to. She goes on to say, the owner of this particular MRA group did not respond to a request for comment, but has long proclaimed domestic violence is not a gendered issue. And I would agree with him. It's a generational issue. And as we will see in a little bit, it seems to be a racial issue, but Sherele Moody isn't going to bring that up. Let's continue. This is despite all the reputable data clearly showing that, yes, it is a gendered issue because women are the primary victims of violence at the hands of a current or former partner, and men are the primary perpetrators of this violence. Yeah, that really depends on which studies you look at, doesn't it? Because there are other studies that clearly dispute that. But many of these studies, the ones that Sherele Moody supports, do a nasty little trick. They minimize female perpetrators by claiming that they're actually victims operating in self-defense. And we'll see that in a minute. She goes on to say, that said, men do experience intimate partner abuse, but it is more likely to be emotional.
Obviously, I would like to start with you, Leon. How do you say that your ex treated you? What did she do?
She was very, very clever. It started quite subtly, and it worked up to physical, which led to emotional, and ultimately, if you like, financial, where everything was controlled. I lived in fear, didn't know what I was coming home to.
What was the physical abuse? What did she do to you?
Punches to the torso, so it couldn't be seen at work.
And what would lead to that? Describe the scenario where she would end up punching you in the chest.
It would be anger of some kind, something that happened in her day, and she wanted to vent when she got home, or if something hadn't gone right. It could be small things to big things, things that weren't of my control mainly.
And what impact did that have on you?
Oh, I was a shell of a person. I felt very vulnerable because I didn't even know my identity anymore. Like I said, I didn't even know what I was coming home to at the end of the day. You left feeling half the person you should be. Very, very damaging.
And when they do die in domestic violence situations, their killers are usually other male family members or female partners who have used self-defense as a last resort. Now, the problem with this is whenever a female kills a male partner, the automatic claim that is made is self-defense, even when it is clearly not the fucking case. Let me give you a recent example. A Sunshine Coast woman who admitted to dumping her partner's headless torso and setting it on fire is arguing she acted in self-defense, a Brisbane court has heard. Lindy Williams pleaded not guilty to murdering George Gerbic, but guilty to interfering with a corpse at the beginning of her trial in the Supreme Court in Brisbane. The 66-year-old's headless torso was discovered on fire on the side of Cedar Pocket Road near Gympie in September 2013. So when the police were originally investigating this, she told the police that the murder victim was actually overseas, and she also accessed his bank account and sent text messages and emails from him to create the impression that he was still alive. So the police did a bit more investigating, and they returned to ask her more questions, and suddenly she changed her story. So apparently George came home angry, and there was some dispute with his ex-wife or something, according to his murderer. And George then attacked Miss Williams with a steak knife. Of course, there's no evidence of this apart from Miss Williams' testimony. She told police he slipped on blood on the floor and fell backwards and hit his head, her lawyer said. Blood on the floor. So apparently the blood came from a cut caused by this steak knife. Now, to my knowledge, she has not produced any evidence that she was ever cut. And if there was enough blood that he slipped on it, it must have been a pretty severe wound. You would think that she would have gone to hospital and there'd be hospital records, right? Apparently there's not, though. Apparently she left the house, she rented a car, and stayed in a motel for a few days before returning home. And when she got home, George was no longer lying on the floor where she had last seen him. So she thought he must have been okay. I'm sure she was very, very concerned. She said she headed down towards the bedroom and she discovered his torso, she says, wrapped in plastic on the floor. Yeah, that seems like a legitimate story. I reckon that happens quite a lot. Someone has an argument, they leave the home for a couple of days, and when they come back they find their partner with their head decapitated and their body wrapped in plastic. Happens all the time. Clearly she's innocent. The prosecution said Miss Williams told police she didn't know what to do with the torso, so she wrapped it in a tarp, dumped it on the side of the road, and set the remains alight so police would find it. Yeah, that seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do, right? You find a dead body in your home, instead of ringing the police and saying, hey, someone must have broken in and killed my partner, what you do is you wrap it in a tarp and leave it somewhere on fire so the police can find it easily, right? That sounds legitimate. I don't know why anyone would have a problem with her story. Her lawyer said, when asked about the torso, she thought that a friend may have come and cut up the body. Yeah. I shouldn't be laughing because this man was murdered, but it's hard not to, considering how unbelievable her lies are. I can't believe that she or her lawyer actually thought that anyone would actually believe this. Although I'm sure there are some feminists out there who would claim that it must have been self-defense. So the defense barrister, Simon Lewis, told the court that Mr. Gerbic was an impatient and violent man and his client had acted in self-defense. Yeah, I'd love to see some actual evidence of that apart from her testimony. Now, as far as I know, there is none that he was a violent man, nor that she acted in self-defense. He said, you will hear that my client told a lot of lies to a lot of people, and as my learned friend described, she was living a lie. Yes, she was, Mr. Lewis said. This isn't a whodunit. My client caused the death of Mr. Gerbic. That's not what the trial is about. People lie for a lot of reasons. Was she covering up, as my learned friend says, a murder? Or was she covering up a killing that happened in self-defense? So it doesn't matter what the circumstances are. When a woman kills her male partner, 99 times out of 100, she will claim that it's self-defense. Now, in this particular case, the evidence was stacked against her, and her lies were so unbelievable that she was found guilty, and she was sentenced to life in prison. That's a good verdict. She should be sentenced to life in prison, and I hope she lives a very, very long time in there. But not all cases are this clear-cut, and I believe that courts are more willing to believe a woman as being a victim even when she's a murderer. Now, to be fair, there are clearly cases where that's true. There are clearly cases where someone has acted in self-defense, but there are clearly cases where that's not the case, and self-defense is just an excuse. But what feminists like Sherele Moody like to do is class any murder by a woman as an act of self-defense, and therefore the female becomes the victim, the male becomes the perpetrator, and suddenly it disappears. It's no longer a statistic, and we're left with gendered violence because it only counts when a man murders a woman. It doesn't count when it goes the other way. Anyway, let's continue with this article because we're getting to a very, very interesting bit. Last year, the New South Wales Domestic Violence Death Review Team published its report into all DV homicides in that state from 2012 to 2014. The report was based on police investigations and criminal and coroner court outcomes, and it revealed that 159 women were killed by current or former male partners and family members in the 14 years, and none of the murdered men died at the hands of an abusive female. 14 years. That's strange because it says up here 2012 to 2014, so that would be 2 years. But anyway, that's not the point I want to focus on. The point I want to focus on is the fact that she claims that none of the murdered men died at the hands of an abusive female. So most people who read this will come to the conclusion that no men were murdered by their female partners. That's not true. There were men murdered by female partners. It's just that those female murderers have been reclassified to be victims. Therefore, they're not abusive females. Therefore, the murders they commit have been erased. This is an incredibly dirty trick. So you start with the conclusion that violence is gendered. So when males do it to females, it's because of the patriarchy and male supremacy and men wanting to oppress women. And when women do it to men, it's always done in self-defense. And then to prove this claim, you show statistics of men murdering women and no women murdering men. But of course, these statistics have been fudged by deleting all the women who have murdered men because they're victims, right? This is basically an ideological circular argument. But since Sherele wrote this article, there has been a new report out. And it doesn't cover just New South Wales, but it covers all the states in Australia. It's called the Australian Domestic and Family Violence Death Review Network Data Report 2018. And it was released May of this year. And it looks at all intimate partner homicides that have occurred across Australia between the years 2010 and 2014. Now, I don't trust this report for the reasons that I've just previously stated. It uses terms like primary DV abuser and primary DV victim. So the primary DV abuser, the person who primarily initiated domestic violence in the life of the relationship and or was the main aggressor of domestic violence after the relationship had ended. I wonder which gender that's referring to. This term is designed to highlight that a person may have been the primary user of domestic violence prior to the homicide, and the homicide may have been perpetrated by a person who was typically a victim of domestic violence, for instance, a victim who kills an abuser in self-defense. Primary DV victim. The person who primarily had domestic violence used against them was victimized during the relationship with an abuser or after that relationship had ended. The term designates a person who experienced but did not initiate domestic violence. This term is designed to highlight that a person may be the primary victim of domestic violence prior to a homicide, but may ultimately perpetrate that homicide. So in other words, when a woman kills her male partner, it doesn't count because she is the primary DV victim using violence in self-defense. I wonder how deeply they investigate to see whether she's telling the truth or, they just take her word for it, right? Because after all, we know domestic violence is gendered.
Did you think about calling the police, going to the police?
I did. The problem you have is that you're in denial that it's happening at all. You kind of think, am I to blame for that? It was only when I came across somebody else that was going through that, I thought, I recognise half of those things in my own life. I found the police not very helpful at all. I think, and we'll probably discuss this, there's an educational need for the police to accept that domestic violence isn't a female monopoly.
How did they treat you then?
Oh, dismissive.
Dismissive?
I'm still waiting even 2 years later for some kind of domestic abuse support. It doesn't appear on their radar that men can be victims. And the complete lack of faith in the system and the services. As a result, my view of the police has changed to one of distrust and certainly no faith. I was brought up in a time where you had to respect authority. But I've learned that that has to be earned. And when you turn to the police, the one and only time you actually need their help and they're not there, that's it. That's all your cards play.
I wonder then, I mean, if there is a man watching who may find themselves maybe in a scenario similar to the one you have described, would you recommend that they contact the police?
I should say yes, but speaking from experience, I think you're probably leaving yourself wide open to further accusations, because what will happen is that she'll then accuse you and you'll be taken away.
Is that what happened to you?
Absolutely, it did.
So you went to the police, she accused you of what?
She accused me of assault.
Right.
And I had evidence, I had photographic evidence, written evidence, which I'd actually given to my boss. And the police decided to dismiss that because it didn't fit within what they perceived to be a domestic abuse situation. And it always seemed to be, and I've spoken to other men about this, it's always easy to take the man away. Well, you're taken away, but where do you go? And that's why I'd kind of say, well, I don't really trust the police.
Right. So what happened to you? She reported you for assault, and did they come and arrest you, or what?
They took me away, yeah.
They arrested you?
Yeah, I went to court. The judge said there's absolutely no evidence here, and threw it out. The whole thing took about 10 minutes. I raised the fact that I had evidence from my case, and the police went, we're not going to do anything about it. It's done and dusted.
Mark.
So it doesn't really need that much investigation, does it? Now, having a look through this report, I found some very, very interesting statistics. So between 2010 and 2014, there were 152 intimate partner homicides in Australia. Now, that includes males and females. So according to this report, that works out to be about 38 deaths a year, which is interesting because that's around about half of what we were told in 2016. But there are some more interesting things to come. Now, let's compare some statistics of males who killed female intimate partners and females who killed male intimate partners. It says here, almost half of the males who killed a female partner were using alcohol at the time of the homicide. So that's 59, which works out to be 48.8%. And if we look at the female comparison, half of the females who killed males were using alcohol at the time of the fatal episode. Fatal episode, that's an interesting term. And that's 14, which works out to be exactly 50%. So I think it's safe to say that alcohol is a major factor in domestic violence homicides. Another interesting thing is almost half of the male offenders were unemployed. Now, I imagine being unemployed and having money issues would be a stressful thing that might put a strain on a relationship and increase the likelihood of domestic violence, especially if alcohol is involved. Now, we also find that about half of the female homicide victims were unemployed at the time of the homicide. Now, what was an interesting statistic was almost 20% of males who killed a female intimate partner identified as Aboriginal, and almost half of the female homicide offenders identified as Aboriginal. So if I were to do some quick math, about 1/4 of all domestic violence perpetrators in Australia are Aboriginal. Now, why that's a significant number is because Aboriginals only make up 3.3% of the Australian population. Now, before anyone starts screaming racist at me, there are a lot of reasons why this is the case. There are some very serious issues in some Aboriginal communities. Issues involving alcohol and unemployment and generational issues, including generational violence and high levels of poverty. And clearly these issues need to be fixed. Now, I'm not exactly sure how we go about fixing them. It's a very, very complex issue. And it's a very, very complex issue which is wrapped up in a lot of political correctness which means a lot of people are afraid to say anything at all, let alone offer solutions. But the point is that those communities, and I'm not suggesting for the record that all Aboriginal people or all Aboriginal communities are like this, but there are some Aboriginal communities which have some very, very serious issues. And if those communities are causing 1/4 of the domestic violence deaths because of the serious issues in those communities, then it would suggest that domestic violence homicides in the rest of the Australian community is far less of an issue than what we're being told by feminists. Now, that's not to say that it's unimportant. Of course it's not. Domestic violence is an important issue for both men and women, or at least it should be an important issue for both men and women. But the number of deaths and the causes of that violence and those deaths have been blown out of proportion by feminists. And you will never, ever, ever hear them talk about the 25% of those deaths occurring in communities that make up 3.3% of the population. It will never happen. They will never shine any spotlight on those communities because they're not white. And anyone who brings up this particular interesting statistic will be classed as a racist. But now that we've debunked some of the bullshit put out there by Sherele Moody in this article, let's get back to that main question. The question which inspired her to write this article in the first place. If a woman hits you, would you hit her back? Well, the simple answer is it's not a yes or no question. It really depends on a large number of factors. It depends on how you're being hit, how often you're being hit, the circumstances, your size compared to her size. And of course, if you do hit her back, then it has to be proportional. If a woman pushes you, that doesn't give you the right to hit her in the head 50 times, clearly. But I will say that if you don't want to get hit, then you shouldn't hit other people to begin with, and that goes for males or females. And there are most definitely circumstances where women have initiated violence, and I have absolutely no sympathy for them when they get violence in return. For example,
Punch him.
Get out of here. Jesse, get the fuck out. No, jump me up.
Let me through, bitch.
What happened?
No, jump me the fuck up.
You see your face?
I'm good.
Oh, let me see the face, dude.
Is that less strong? Jump me up or not?
Yeah. Well, why is your face bleeding?
It's not, nigga. Are you gonna jump me the fuck up? This is less strong.
Yeah,
Dude,
why did she
you're
punch
gonna
you?
get me in
You won't
trouble.
punch him again.
This is less strong.
You won't punch him again.
Less strong.
Stop
You
betting
won't do
me.
it.
I'm
No,
just
you won't.
trying to take a shot.
You better call the police.
Ain't nobody trying to take a shot with you.
Are you gonna fucking
Call
jump
the
me
police.
up or
Call
not,
the police
nigga?
hunter. Call the police hunter.
Tell them to scoop you.
And I'm 17. I can get charged
It don't
against
matter.
you.
I'm still trying.
We got video of you pushing my ass against the
My
table.
brother's a detective. It don't matter. Just stop. Are you gonna jump me up or not, Jesse? Please. Please, just stop. Jesse, are you gonna jump me up or not?
Yeah.
Please. I know, but you're gonna get me in trouble. Are you
No,
gonna fucking
I'd
jump
be
me up?
quiet.
No, you're not. Are you gonna fucking drop me off or not, nigga?
Yeah.
I swear to fucking God, nigga.
It's for the fucking God, nigga.
Ooh, whoa.
Dude.
Whoa.
Dude.
You just crossed the line right there.
Please go. Please go. On that note, please go.
No.
Drop me up for a while, nigga.
You alright?
No. No, dude, that's not cool. That's not
You
drop me
just crossed the line right there.
Dude. No, just stop. Just stop. You gotta drop me off for one, nigga. She gave me a black eye, nigga. She gave me a swollen eye. Hey, yo, please go. Please go. Please go.
Yeah, sit down.
Look at this.
Take a seat. I'm sorry.
I'll
Take a seat.
Hey, yo. You gotta drop me off for what?
Dude.
Just, you know.
Get the fuck out.
so she hit him repeatedly and was laughing about the fact that she was violent towards him, and even made fun of him, saying, ring the cops because they're not going to do anything. Yet when he retaliated and hit her once, suddenly it was a shock. How could he hit me? How could he do this? Now, if that's not a form of privilege, I don't know what is. She obviously thought she had the right to hit him as much as possible, whenever she wanted, without any consequence. But how dare he lay a finger on her in return? Now, under those circumstances, I have no sympathy for her. If she had have kept her hands to herself and not laid a finger on him, she wouldn't have got hit in return. Not that I think violence is a good solution. Obviously, the best thing for everyone would have been if no one got hit that particular night. Now, just to finish off, Sherele Moody gives us some advice, or gives men some advice, what to do if they're being hit by a female. The first bit of advice is walk away and do not retaliate. Yeah, I wonder if she'd give that same advice to women who have murdered their husbands supposedly in self-defense. Maybe they should have just walked away instead of killing their husbands, Sherele. Now, look, the counter-argument to that claim is that people aren't always able to walk away. They may be emotionally broken down. They may not be able to leave because they have children, and they don't want to leave those children in a violent home situation with their abusive partner. Or they may not have anywhere to go, which is definitely the case when it comes to men, considering there are no shelters here in Australia. But I would generally agree that if you can walk away, you probably should. And although retaliating may be justified under self-defense, you could potentially end up being the one arrested. So it's not always the smart thing to do. Next, she says, if it is safe, speak to her about what has happened. Tell them it is not acceptable and urge them to get help. I wonder if she would give the same advice to abused women. Now, in some cases, that may, in fact, be good advice, but in many cases, it's going to have no effect on an abusive partner, whether they're male or female. Next, she says, contact police to report the violence and seek medical attention so your injuries, scratches, bruises, and others can be documented. Now, this would be good advice if the police actually took male victims seriously.
I had evidence, I had photographic evidence, written evidence, which I'd actually given to my boss. And the police decided to dismiss that because it didn't fit within what they perceived to be a domestic abuse situation.
And as we saw in a recent video of mine, here in Victoria they're bringing in training to teach police that females are victims and males are perpetrators. And if a male claims to be a victim, well, you know, that's a victimizer pretending to be a victim to try to get away with it, right? This is what feminists have been teaching us. So, under those circumstances, contact police. Yeah, it's probably not going to be very effective. Ideally, it would be the thing to do, but not in a feminist environment, unfortunately. Next, she says, speak to police, your lawyer, or your local community legal centre about your opinions regarding domestic violence orders. Once again, it's maybe good advice. I would say that if you are a victim of domestic violence, then yeah, you should get a domestic violence order. What Sherele Moody doesn't seem to realise, though, is that every time a man does this, feminists scream that he's only doing it to victimise the real victim, in other words, the female. She needs to talk to some of her fellow feminists about this, I think. Then she says, phone Men's Line on 1-800-600-636 or 1-800-RESPECT or your local domestic violence service to seek the support of trained professionals. They will be able to link you with crisis accommodation, therapy, material aid and legal support. That is perfect advice if you're female, not so much if you're male. Now, I'm not an expert on Men's Line, but I do believe they give online therapy. Now, I don't know what that therapy is like, but I guess it's a start. 1-800-RESPECT, though, is rather gendered, and I suspect that all they would do is refer you to therapy for abusers, which is the typical thing when men try to seek help in these situations. There's lots and lots of therapy out there if you're an abusive male, next to none if you're an actual victim of abusive females. I don't know what your local domestic violence service is going to do. They tend to all be gendered. Now, there may be some which are neutral out there, but the vast majority tend to be female victim, male perpetrator, and aren't really set up to deal with male victims. And crisis accommodation. What crisis accommodation is there for male victims, Sherele? Now, I have heard some feminists say that there are hundreds of spots in Australia for male victims of domestic abuse, and when pushed to demonstrate this, they link you to homeless shelters. Yeah, I don't know if that's exactly the crisis accommodation that those men should be getting. I know it wouldn't be acceptable for women, right? I mean, if someone suddenly shut down all the domestic abuse shelters for women because, hey, they can just go to a homeless shelter, I don't think the feminists would be too happy about that, and with good reason. And of course, she said legal support. Legal support's the last one. Yeah. I don't know how much legal support is out there for male victims of domestic abuse. I know that there is most definitely legal support for female victims. Male victims, it might be a bit lacking. Next, she says, if you are in a domestic violence situation and you cannot leave immediately because of children and or pets, ask a DV service or your local public DV liaison officer to help you formulate a safety plan to get you and your loved ones to safety. Yeah, once again, this is great advice if you're a female, but not so much if you happen to have a penis. If a man were to leave with his children, I'm pretty sure his ex-partner would be ringing the cops, and it would be seen as him stealing her children, and I have no doubt that many feminists out there would categorize it as him stealing the children to get revenge on his ex-wife because he's the real abuser, right? And lastly, she says, tell your friends, family, employers and colleagues so they can help you in whatever way is needed. And that's not bad advice, although the problem is, all these people are less likely to believe you than if you're a female because of all the gendered advertising we constantly see everywhere. Females as victims and males as perpetrators. And when you bring up the opposite, a lot of people just can't accept it because they've been trained into thinking it only goes one way. So basically, Sherele Moody is saying that men should never hit women under any circumstances. And let me stress, I think that if a man is going to hit a woman, it should be under very unique circumstances and in self-defense. But she seems to think that men should never hit women no matter what, and they should do every single thing possible to avoid it, even if it's a self-defense situation. While at the same time, any woman who kills her husband is clearly a victim, and, she had no choice, right? And apparently there's no double standard when it comes to that. Now, just to finish off, I've got a couple of small corrections, an update with some interesting information, and a little bit more background information. So I'll try to get through this rather quickly. First of all, for some reason, I've been calling Sherele Moody. I don't know why I started doing this and continue doing this. Maybe I saw Sherele somewhere. I don't remember. But it is Sherele Moody, not Sherele. I don't know how I got that in my head. I'm not particularly good with names. I've got a fantastic memory, except for names, and I'm good with logic, but I really, really suck when it comes to names. In fact, my last video with the Young Turks, I referred to Betsy DeVos as Betty DeVos a number of times. It's just the way my brain works. It doesn't do names. To be honest with you, I'm surprised I remember my own name half the time. The other correction is I referred to Mr. Fuller as Lindy Williams' lawyer. In fact, he was the prosecutor. Now, I made this mistake because he was reading out her excuses. So let me correct that, although it doesn't change the point I was making in any way, but I want to be as accurate as possible. So Todd Fuller is the prosecutor, not the defense lawyer. Speaking of Lindy Williams, 10 years before she murdered her male partner and cut his head off and left his burning body on the side of the road, she was in the news. Apparently, she was kidnapped and tortured at the hands of a sadistic psychopath. The thing is, this story turned out to be entirely fabricated. She made the whole thing up and cut herself. So it seems she's got quite a long history of lying, and I'm betting these aren't the only 2 times she's done this. And lastly, I have some additional background information on Sherele Moody, which you may find interesting. It seems 27 years ago, her stepfather was a serial killer who murdered little girls. So I think this might start to explain why she is such an extreme ideologue who is obsessed with male violence and female victims.